Good morning, everyone. Okay, I am hoping the opening note instills some good energy in all of us. So just get a quick check. Can I get some voice from everyone? Hi, good morning. Oh, lovely. I was hoping I'll have to say something smaller like a hi or hello. But yes, that works. Perfect. On that note, we'll start with our first keynote for today. For the first keynote speaker, we have someone who uses art, an underrepresented skill set in open source, to get people excited about contributing. Well, we're really excited to welcome Mars Lee. She's a technical illustrator who makes bite-sized comics that explain technical topics. With her most recent works, like How to Contribute to NumPy and How to Write Alt Text for Scientific Diagrams and Documentation Comics, she's one amazing, amazing person. Well, I hope you got to see her around yesterday. She was meeting all of us in person. Outside of conferences, you can always find her making zines and roller skating across the New York City. If you are excited to know a lot more even about her, do follow her both on Twitter, X, or LinkedIn. And on that note, let's have a big round of applause for Mars.
Hello, everyone. Hello, thank you for having me here. Thank you, PyCon India. Welcome to my talk, How Open Source Opened My Opportunities. So I have these little pamphlets, papers. You're gonna find out more real soon. So, as you can see, I am a keynote speaker, and I'm pointing that out literally because this is my first in-person keynote. This is my first time in India, and I flew all the way from New York City. So thank you truly from the bottom of my heart for giving me the opportunity to talk here today. Thank you. And so you might have seen from the talk description the grand talking points worthy of a keynote, how open source led to my first job in tech, how I got over my insecurities about contributing to NumPy, how I contribute as an instructor and as an artist, and how you can contribute as well. So yes, a keynote. It sounds grand, it sounds inspirational. It's just like the stock photo over here of some guy talking to the crowd over here like this. But hey, I also promised something else, to get a paper copy of my educational resource, How to Contribute to NumPy Comics. And we're gonna do that. Yep. So yes, you're gonna get a comic. You're gonna get a comic. Everyone is gonna get a comic, except, ding, 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 ding. Oh. Wait, what's going on? I heard an alarm in the audience too. Is it something after me? Oh, dang it. I apologize. It seems like, despite all the drum roll and anticipation that I built up over yesterday, there are no comics to be found. There are no comics this morning due to a printing error. The comics will be ready in the afternoon. So please find me after my talk in the afternoon. I'll just be like handing out like little box loads of comics. I really wish I could give it to you today, right now, but we're gonna make do. So yes, I apologize, and on with the show. So since we don't have paper comics, feel free to scan this QR code. And if you're watching remotely after the fact and do not have a comic in hand, don't worry. You can also scan a QR code. Hey, double duty. And if you go to the digital version, you'll be also able to download a PDF. And you could print more copies. You could print your personal copies, a very reasonable number of copies, however copies you want, with the office printer that you certainly have permission to use. And with that, you could print more copies, and then you could drop them off to your coworkers, to your friends, your dogs, your loved ones. You like NumPy comics? Share the NumPy comics. So yes, those are the comics. Let's get to the talk. Yeah, you might be wondering, why comics? Why comics? It's kind of out of the blue. Well, I want you to imagine that you're reading some documentation, you're doing your due diligence, and you're understanding how a library or an API works. But it's pretty dry, boring even, page after page. You're reading, but you're not really understanding. Your eyes are kind of glazing over. You flip back and forth trying to find that one thing that you need. And you start thinking to yourself, where did my life go wrong? I can't answer that last question, but I can answer the first question about documentation. And the answer is comics. That's right, comics. Documentation. Comics as documentation. But wait a second. What documentation do you turn into comics? It wasn't the NumPy user guide. It wasn't the array documentation, nor was it about, array objects. The documentation is actually a story. It's a story about NumPy, and it's a story of how you can contribute to NumPy. It follows a story of 3 students, 2 midterms, 1 open source library. How hard could it be? So this tells a story of why NumPy is useful, how to use NumPy, some of the pain points you might have, and can we improve this? Yes, we can, because NumPy is open source. Wait, what is open source, and how do you contribute to NumPy? It is really a story of how NumPy is built by the people who use it, who are scientists and students, just like many of you all here today. And so I'm going to give you a little overview of what the story is. So it starts off at the University of Monty Library, and these 3 students have finished a lab, and they need to look at some cell images with NumPy. But one of them doesn't really know how to use NumPy, and another one does. So thankfully, they're here to help each other. The comics move between the story and the technical information. This one is focused on how is NumPy used in microbiology, why arrays instead of images, and how is this useful in data processing and analysis. We then follow a step-by-step guide as the students start to use NumPy. But you know how you start using a thing because you think it looks easy, and then it becomes increasingly difficult, and you can't quite step away from it because you're like, no, this time I swear I got it. That is a feeling you may have faced while using NumPy. And we have this one student outlined here in particular, and they're pretty confused. There's a lot of files that we're trying to get with this MPZ file type. How do we know which one is ours? How do we know which one we want to use from our lab? And so starting by asking this question, you start getting it back and forth. You're right. The cell images I want are not over here, but don't worry, like if I actually investigate over here using dictionaries and the keys, and then if we oversee the keys view as the dictionary-like object, but it's not quite the same, and so the attributes of this object is actually different from this, and I know it's acting a bit differently from what you've learned, but don't worry, with NumPy it's all different, it's gonna totally work out. Yes, this is a pretty common feeling. I think we've all experienced this kind of information overload. And that is like one whole page of information. In fact, that is so much information I could barely fit into this whole slide legibly. And so a student bursts in and says, what, why, what is going on? You told me NumPy would be useful, would be better, would be faster, more efficient. Why do we have to do this? Why can't we just look at pictures, and why do we have to use this array and the numbers and everything? And so we have this back and forth of like, well, you just need to, do this in this specific way, and everything except for this one thing will be fine. And each student has a different response to this. One is accepting of NumPy it is, I don't want to rock the boat. Another is critical, they should fix it. And the last one agrees. But NumPy can be better, and we can help make it better. And so we have this brief introduction and this beautiful picture of the world of open source, about how we strive to make open science, the ideals and the values, to build the tools that make scientific research more collaborative and transparent. Look at that. Look at that, the globe and the people. And we got our friends Julia and R over there. They're our friends, not our enemies. And so that's pretty good. We have the ideals. But what are you supposed to do? How do we act on those ideals and make NumPy better? What are the steps? Do you make an issue? Well, the student does believe in the value of open source, but hasn't contributed anything before and hasn't even submitted an issue yet. I think a lot of us have been exposed to open source, but what do we do? So don't worry, one of them has a GitHub account, so the 3 of them will make an issue about this usability problem in NumPy. We then have several more pages of this going step by step, where they go to the NumPy website, they look at the GitHub repo, they start writing their first issue, and they have this back and forth of like, am I writing too much? Am I writing too little? And that's like, what am I even doing? Who are these strangers on the internet? What's going on? And then there's more and more pages explaining the contributor workflow and like, who are the maintainers? And the maintainers are not that scary, but who is the other contributor? How do they know the code base? So all of this is more is you can read more, read the docs. It is there. You will read it online, and you'll find out later this afternoon with the paper copies. And so they then ties back to this. And this is me. Yes, so you might be wondering, okay, I just talked about the comics, but who am I? Who is this Mars Lee? And how is this tied to like opportunities? And how did you make these comics? Because you explain what are comics, but you don't explain how you made the comics. And so I am described as a technical illustrator. And just like, there's technical writers that write documentation, I also help documentation, but I make illustrations. You could also broadly call me an art instructor, an artist. I do documentation, I do onboarding, community. I like to also say I do vibes. I bring good vibes. And so the two communities I'm a part of is NumPy and open source design. And from that, you might be able to tell you don't seem like the typical contributor of open source. Then tell me, what is the typical contributor of open source? Or maybe we could rephrase the question. What is the expected contributor of open source? So let's compare like our expectations to me. So you might expect a contributor to be like a software engineer who has like a computer science degree and knows the ins and outs of their favorite open software before they even become a contributor. I don't necessarily fit into any of those. In fact, I feel like the expected contributor is just some sort of like hacker master hacking into the mainframe. And then you have little me who's not any of those things. I'm an artist. I do not have a CS degree. And before I started working in open source, the extent of my knowledge was free alternatives to Photoshop, please, because I really don't want to pay $25 a month to get access to this. So I am not the expected contributor. I am the unexpected contributor. So how did this unexpected contributor start contributing to open source? How the heck did I get here? To really, really understand, we're gonna go back in time. We're gonna go back to New York City. We're gonna talk to New York City. We're gonna go back to PyData New York City, and we're gonna go back to 2019. So, as I told you, I do not have a CS degree. In fact, I don't have any degree. I am a college dropout. And it's not in like a cool way. Like I was not like a Zuckerberg, and nor did I have like billions of dollars to throw into a innovative prototype of the future. I did not have those things. And I moved to New York City, but again, it was not in like a cool way. I just had family there. I was not, Carrie Bradshaw living up my highest New York City life. It was actually a pretty sad period, kind of bumming around. But I decided to take that time in between my life to start learning how to code. And there's actually a lot of great resources. Like there's a local Queensborough Community College, resources like Code Academy. And so I took that time to start learning and building a new skill set. What really started to change things was that a friend told me about the PyData New York City Diversity Scholarship. And at that point, I have touched Python, but I am not a pro. I occasionally used open source like GIMP, but I was certainly not a contributor. And scholarships are for the like really dedicated, right? Like those who really love Python. And thankfully, in the application, they said, even if you're not an expert, in fact, if you're just interested, please go apply. And so I applied, I got my application ready, I edited it, double checked it, and was like, okay, let's send it. And I got rejected. Okay, maybe I didn't fit the typical profile after all. But a week later, turns out I got accepted. And that is because we got a second round of funding. That's right, PyData receives money from sponsors. And these sponsors this money goes into funding, supporting open source, and getting scholarships for people like here. I wish I remembered which ones. If I could just, I'll find you in the booth later. I'll find the sponsors and be like, hey, thank you for sponsoring PyCon India, because you're making students, all sorts of people, access Python and open source. So that saved me 500 US dollars. So thank you. And so I decided, all right, let's go. So in my time in PyData New York City, I learned about the PyData ecosystem. You get data science and data engineering. I learned about the fields of astronomy and geospatial, causal inference, and orchestrating workflows. I also learned some of the other things people do from PyData. Like people like to learn about PyData because they're trying to maybe avoid some other thing and they want to talk about something else and they want to talk about data frames. There's like a whole culture, there's a whole world out there. And so I came in like, all right, I'm gonna learn all the projects. But there's so many projects, actually, I don't know what's going on. I had the enthusiasm and I was absorbing it like a sponge. And I wanted to share what I learned. So I decided to sign up for a lightning talk. And at that point, that was my first ever lightning talk. And of course, when you sign up, it's like, well, what are you gonna share? Thing is, I don't have domain knowledge or years of experience in Python, but I do have domain knowledge and years and experience in something else. Comics. Surprise, comics. This one was talking about me learning to use React, setting it up with Express servers, things like that, using these characters, quite familiar to my current work. And so I took what I already knew, which was comics. I took what I was learning, and then boom, in the middle, created something that combined all of these things, something that I was proud of, something that showed, hey, this is what I'm trying to do in the world. And so I gave a lightning talk on comics and code. And once I was giving that lightning talk, I no longer doubted that I could be here, that I could take up space and I could stand up tall. I introduced myself as a diversity scholar, that I'm here to take advantage of the opportunities where they're presented. I just let people know, hey, I'm unabashedly unashamed to be new, but I'm also eager to learn. And I just delighted in showing off my artistic skills that give me so much joy and just aren't common in the community. And so, I did my 5 minutes, finished. And in the audience was the director of a company that's focused on open source Python. So just imagine this scenario here. Let's go back, 2019. I will give you a warning. This is not a word-to-word recording. It's modified for clarity for entertainment purpose only. But Ralph Galmers was in the audience, and he was like, whoa, we're looking for a website and a design person. And there's one right here in front of me. And so afterwards, he approached me and said, hey, that was a cool talk. You want to work on open source with us? And I was like, what? I mean, yes, of course I would love to work on open source. And great, you're hired. Awesome, yeah. Hey, wait, I'm still kind of new to this open source thing. Are you sure? Yes, we're sure. We are looking for a designer. We are looking to expand the skill sets and the people in open source. Don't worry, we'll guide you through it. And that is the start of how open source opened my opportunities and led to my first job in tech. So, if you would like to read more about that experience, you can check out my blog post where I go through a bit more of how that all worked. So yes, that is all the way in 2019. How does this lead back to the NumPy comics here in 2024? So the short answer is I got a grant to work on it. Like many other contributions, it was through a grant, and you could have grants to do a bug fix or to do a version release. Like a version release of how Gumpy got a $10,000 grant from the GBI Foundation to finally push a 3.0 release after 7 years of stasis and a 2.0 something. That, it was completely made up. That was just for explanatory purposes, but it was just give you an outline of how open source scientific Python is funded. They're funded by institutions that are trying to advance scientific research. This is some of the blog posts that actually explain in way more detail, like the actual information, but you have big companies or NASA who are using things like NumPy, Pandas, and AstroPy to look at images of the black holes or solve like cancer in the next like 50 years. And so I decided, okay, I'll go find someone who wants to give me money. I'll go find some grant giver. I decided to go to Google Season Docs, and last year I was like, hey, want to give me money to work on this for a few months? And they said, yeah. And so, yeah, I finished it. Thanks. Okay, that's the end of the talk. No, that was not the end. That was not the end of all. It's kind of explains it, but also don't. It's kind of anticlimactic. Because yes, you get grants to work on open source, but comics are not like your typical open source contribution. In fact, it's probably the first time you've heard of comics in open source. Surely the process of creating the comics was different? And that is true. Making comics is quite a different beast from a code contribution. Also, okay, let's go back, way back. Why the heck is a designer contributing to NumPy? Last time I checked, NumPy does not have a GUI, is famously does not. And Jupyter Notebooks, writing NumPy in Jupyter Notebooks don't count. That's Jupyter Notebooks, that's a separate project. They have their own GUI. No, you're not gonna catch me there. So to answer the question, why the heck is a designer contributing to NumPy? Well, that's because my mentors and my managers are part of the core NumPy team. And they believe that I deserve the space to learn and contribute as much as they did. Especially since I have a underrepresented skill set in open source. So maybe instead of saying, you don't really belong here, they started saying, well, how can we help you belong here? Let's rephrase the question. Instead of why is a designer contributing to NumPy, let's ask, how does a designer start contributing to NumPy? And so for me, it really just started by being in the community, sitting in the NumPy community calls with the support of my mentors, and just absorbing the culture and the practices. And I also wrote the meeting minute notes. And so another question could be, what insecurities does a designer have about contributing to NumPy? These are some of the many, many thoughts I've had while sitting in those meetings. But a really big one was, gee, everyone else is so much smarter than me. They build a foundational package for the scientific Python ecosystem that has over 32 packages just dependent on it, and they know the C internals. I know people know the C internals. I'm looking at someone over here who does, but not everyone does, and certainly I did not. What could I possibly know? What could I possibly contribute? Also, it was kind of awkward. Like, I did not have a clear contribution pathway. There was not really like sign up here to do a design for NumPy. I'm here to figure out what that means. And so I took that time and I observed my insecurities, and I shared my insecurities with my mentors, and I received encouragement to continue and to contribute however I can in the capacity that I can. And so I continue to write meeting minute notes. And in writing those meeting minute notes, I was actually doing a really important job. I was recording important conversations and the decision-making process, learning what issues are high priority, what are the evolving funding strategies, how do you organize sprints, and also what are the maintainers who've been here for over a decade have seen, because NumPy is a pretty old project. And they had thoughts like, how do we turn more first-time contributors into repeating contributors? People in sprints and conferences who fly by, how can we come get them back? How can we get more people to make non-code contributions like translations? I was talking to a volunteer at PyCon India who started working in open source because of translations. That is such important, valuable work, but not a lot of people know that is an option. And I also got to learn what the newcomers to NumPy were uncertain about. They wanted to know, what's a good first issue? When do I know I'm ready to review other people's pull requests? And do I know enough? And so in this process of observing myself and observing others, I observed some repeating emotional threads. Do I know enough? How can we tell people that they are enough and that they can try again right now? And so these insecurities that I had as a designer about contributing to NumPy are really the insecurities anyone has about contributing to NumPy. And so that made me think and realize that this is actually really common, these insecurities. And I'm in this middle ground where I can understand, empathize with the maintainers and the team, and I'm in a position where I also really empathize with the newcomers. And I have this skill set. So my question was, how do I use this skill set to help anyone overcome their insecurities about contributing to NumPy? So I decided to make a comic about it. Yeah, comics. Yeah, all the serious thought, like, whoa. Like, how do we contribute and how do I find meaning in the world and community? Comics. Let's make a comic about it. And so now we can actually explain how were these comics made. So this was a early prototype, as you can see, made in August 2022, and it was based off the discussion about the contributor to maintainer pathway. It was kind of like an RPG skill tree of, reviewing, merging, maintenance. It's like kind of like escalating levels of like skill that you could level up to. And also everyone has a funny hat. Hats are cool. Hats are cool all. And so this was something that I shared in the meeting, and you could see it's in the meeting minutes notes as much as any other conversation about organizing sprints or getting funding. And like a code contribution, I also made a GitHub tracking issue. So I could track the conversations we were having that were evolving as we met up over the months to talk about this. I gathered feedback from the NumPy's Newcomers Hour, and that is separate from the NumPy regular community calls. It's actually hosted by Inessa Pawson, who created that space, because there are definitely newcomers, and they may feel kind of intimidated coming to a regular call. So I had a resource that I wanted for newcomers. And here was a space I could talk to newcomers. And so we had a design jam, we had a brainstorming session, we talked about how can we make this better. I also shared with other artists, and that is also really important if you are underrepresented or a minority in a group, is to find other people who are also doing your thing, who understand where you're coming from, so you don't feel as alone doing this. So for me, open source design has been a really important community to feel less alienated and to know that my skill sets are useful out here. And also Saptak, if you're here, hi. We met in the community call, and now we've met in person in PyCon India. That's incredible. So I was using my other communities here to help me understand a new community. And again, it was well received, and I was encouraged to expand on it. So I decided, I guess it's time for me to apply for a grant, because I've seen my coworkers and my friends in Quantsite Labs who got grants to work on release versions or SciPy and things like that. And so I decided, well, yeah, I can do this. I can do the same thing. Yeah, I'll apply for a grant. So I talked to them, got more into the process, and a few months after shopping around, I finally settled on Google Season of Docs. It is similar to Google Season of Code, but it's focused on documentation. And I submitted this, some months after I made the prototype. And the proposal process was kind of interesting, because I have never worked on an academic grant before. My comics talks about research, scientific research, but I don't have that personal experience. But I work with people who do. So I kind of had to understand, okay, how do I work with this world over here, but also work with my world? When I was pitching this, it was more of like a storyboard. It was more like, this is a story of NumPy. And again, I had help from the project mentors, Mukalika and Ross, in making that happen. And so I did the usual grant things. I published a project roadmap. I made timelines, I made budgets, and I listed key personnel. And so, wow, finally, it was accepted. It was accepted with all these other projects, such as Matplotlib and Conda in that season, to make open source documentation better. Woo! So yeah, let's go. Let's freaking go. Let's make this happen. But wait, how do I actually do this? I felt a lot of pressure of NumPy being such a big foundational package. Again, there's that statistic that's, establishes how important NumPy is, but also kind of makes it scary to me, like, what are people going to expect? They're going to probably expect a lot. And I had this challenge, I had this multifold challenge, where I had to build on an existing work, but also create something new. I had to tell a story, but also have correct technical information. It had to be driven by the community, but also show my individual artistic vision. I was wavering and moving between innovate and respect. Is it possible to do both? Well, let's start looking at works that already do both. And so, yeah, let's get inspired. I also talk more about this in my talk about PyData in New York City about this process, but I'm going to go through it here as well. So I was drawing upon these following works to tackle this challenge. So I'll just go through them here. There is, of course, the NumPy documentation. That's the first part where I start. There is the NumPy documentation meetings where, again, I was recording a lot of conversations, what people wanted to implement but not quite implemented. There's also things like diataxis framework, which is something the NumPy team was adopting at that point and is used in other scientific Python libraries as well, of how do you organize information versus tutorials versus API. Do comics and story fill in this section over here? I also drew upon the growing field of contributor experience, and these people like Melissa, Inessa, and Noah. These are other people in the field I really look up to who are doing something similar, focusing on contributor experience. There's also, you might have seen these, the Manga's Guide. You have Manga's Guide to Statistics, you have Manga's Guides to Calculus. There already are visual guides to things. There's also groups that are doing something in between. We have the Turing Way, which also has illustrations and focus on making scientific research more collaborative and transparent. And so I had basically this board over here of 15 different things and telling you no, I swear it all makes sense. I'm going to bring it all together and it's going to work. Don't worry, I got it. And so we take existing best practices and move them over here. We push them somewhere else towards NumPy. All this information already exists. And so we're in that moving process. We have the in-between, and somehow that has turned into the NumPy comics. So how is that made? People have questions like, how do you make comics? How do you turn this alchemy into wisdom? So I'm going to explain a bit more about the comic making process in NumPy, and I'm going to tell you, us Lees know a thing or two about making comics. So I went through some of the steps in that process of pitch, the acceptance, and then we're going to go through brainstorming and narrowing down and script writing, thumbnailing, art, publish, and review. And so with the brainstorming, as I've told you, I've done it with the NumPy community at the newcomers calls, and it was kind of weird to ask the domain experts a most unexpected question. Comics? When I was approaching these meetings, people typically write things in a hackmd, so a very linear format. That personally felt a bit stilted. That format, if we're getting like artsy and scholarly, it reinforces the primacy of words over images, and I wanted to nudge it in the other direction. I wanted these domain experts to feel like they're writers and that they're storyboard artists, sharing that same electrifying energy that you have in the artist room, that creativity and unlimited possibilities. I wanted them to think in visual and nonlinear ways, the ways that I am thinking all the time. And so one really useful tool was a Google Jamboard, a digital whiteboard that anyone could leave comments using sticky notes. They can drag and drop things. They can even scribble little shapes, things like that. And so I let people Jamboard on my prototype. And I also had a formal structure. I approached this as something, okay, I have 20 minutes. I'm going to announce this on the mailing list, let people know this is happening. And I went to 3 different audiences, the regular community call with the maintainers, the documentation call, and the newcomers, because these are all people who are part of the NumPy community and have a say on what we are making. And so this is some of the examples of the like user stories and personas, and how do you turn NumPy into something else in the thesis. So the comments, questions, and concerns with the sticky note over here, you can see it drew like little people. This is how we do brainstorming instead of a HackMD. And in these meetings, we actually had different people with different responses. So in the docs meetings, there's actually a bit more focus on like, how do you, like, what are the metaphors you're using, and does that really translate cleanly into a story? In a community meeting, there was the difficulty of quantifying, the unquantifiable, especially of roles and expectations. And so I was consolidating feedback from 3 different stakeholders, and so there was the documentation, newcomers, and reflecting community practices. So you might have heard something called designing by committee. And if you try to appease everyone with all these different opinions on design, it's too scary, it's too silly, too different, too dark, no, not our brand, witches, alienate, fine, we give up. I kind of expected this would happen. I definitely wanted to get input from as many NumPy users as possible, but this is also where I have to step in as my own domain expert, as the artist, as the driving force of these comics. And so for me, there was just a point where I have to say, okay, that's enough. Now we're going to try turning that into something. So I had to narrow it down, I had to squirrel away, and kind of think, like, what is my artistic vision in all of this? I talked to other artists, I talked to really good resources like Understanding Comics, and again, kind of like the broader fields of like art and communication and meaning. So in talking about the multiple pathways that you can take in NumPy, it decided maybe we won't talk about becoming a maintainer. That's actually like a really broad and totally dependent on the project and what does the responsibilities mean. Let's focus on something much more approachable. What does it take to make your first contribution? And what does it take to make your second contribution? And we're telling one story because it's based off a true story. And this was a story that Ross, one of the project mentors, told me about explicitly showing the MPZ file in NumPy. And so this is an actual issue, this was an actual pull request that had a conversation, and it was actually implemented. And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna take that. There is also parts where you wanna look into, you might be doing the artist studio. Again, we're gonna tie it all together, don't worry. But I had, in the artist studio, I had like my grant, I had my feedback, I had the MPZ file types, I had, the story, and so how do we then put this together into a script, into visual metaphors, into a single process? So the tools that I used are not AI. There was no AI. I did not use generative AI for drawing. It was my old-fashioned hands. It was a 10-year-old Wacom bamboo tablet, and it was Credo, which is an open-source graphic software, because I also wanted to, commit to the open-source ethos in my tools as well. And so I then spent a good amount of time back and forth writing a script of, page 1, page 2, we established a character's rising action. Does this seem accurate to this, to that? And we had to find an overarching story that NumPy is made by the people who use it, scientists, and finding that emotional core of scratch my itch and maybe it helps someone else as well. So I mentioned the comics were based off a true story, which is the MPZ file type here. And I kind of glossed ahead, like, anyway, we talked about it and it worked out. And we fictionalized this into an exciting story. But there's some challenges in there as well, like how do you respect the original contributors and the topic complexity? How do we, go through the hero's journey, but also, not disrespect what the actual process is like? We don't want to over-sensationalize. So the solution in that one was to make our own protagonist. We have protagonists that represent capable contributors. We have protagonists that represent beyond the current user base, like people who are just newcomers. And we also have the stubborn skeptic. And the stubborn skeptic is the one who said early in the story, why do things have to be like this? And so they help each other, fight with each other. This is the Three Stooges energy you might have seen earlier. And they question each other, they learn by the Socratic method, they ask questions. And so this is actually, again, taking from existing documentation practices, represent different user journeys that are then kind of crashing into each other. like that, the Three Stooges. And so it's kind of like externalizing the thinking you may have while using NumPy and putting it out into 3 different people and letting them like duke it out. And it's to show that it's okay to be unsure or to be confused, and that we can clarify the confusion by interacting with community members. So again, we're using the artist's visual metaphors, like turning a GitHub, like writing a GitHub issue into like writing a letter. This one is here, thumbnailing, paneling layout. There's like a whole process to that. And if you want to learn more, there's actually, again, a really good resource. And so sketch, script, final thing. So now we're kind of reaching like the other end of how do you take this existing artistic processes into open source platforms? Like how do you, again, find the middle? How do you do something like a comic and a pull request? How do you pull request review a comic? And so this is something that, again, there are some parallels, there are some similarities. And so I combined those two by then, there we go, yeah. So you can combine the two where I basically put the script on GitHub and I let people review it on GitHub while also letting people write comments on the Google Docs, so letting people of different skill levels who may not use GitHub to comment as well. I also invited artists from open source design who, again, may not use GitHub. And so sharing it across the different channels and the mailing list and making sure people can get a input. So these are some of the input that I had, some of the comics, and transcribing all this feedback into calls, from the calls, yeah, and asking for feedback for specific sections, and kind of like explaining my domain process, my domain knowledge, the artistic process, all the stuff that I just said over here. And in the same way that you have a repository for a code contribution, I made sure to have a repository of all my artifacts as well. So that was tracked in a GitHub issue, announced, Oh wow, this is reminding me I did a lot of stuff over here. But yes, so that is like an overview of that process over there. But you can find out more from this talk. But if we kind of rewind, I actually started in 2019, and I gave a talk on these comics last year in PyData New York City 2023. And so we've actually come full circle, where I was able to give back where I started. I gave a talk about this similar, but I was able to kind of connect more with my local community and like talk to the next generation of diversity scholars, because I benefited from the diversity scholarship and I wanted to keep that going. I also am going to volunteer this year, and this time I'm the one that encouraged a friend to apply, and he got in. And so that cycle of encouragement and support continues. So that was like an overview of like the NumPy comics. But what is next? So I would like to continue the NumPy comics, but there is only one of me, and I think it's more valuable actually to get others to tell their own open source stories. So just imagine if you had like this comic, this is Czar, and Sanket made this. We made a little, this is a very professional photo, but we had a whole zine making workshop at the NumFocus Summit, and we really got tactile. We really got tactile. I guess it could be tactical if you're thinking smart. We got tactile, we had paper, we had scissors, and just kind of like let ourselves be like kids again and be creative. And the end result, I don't know, it's just so beautiful. I have a copy over here, but this is something, this zine I helped make about Czar and that Sanket made, is that I'm just as proud of that as I am with my comics, because it means that something that I have can exist outside of myself, and other people feel encouraged to express themselves as well. And so I actually did something similar. I encouraged him to, I actually just took it and I photocopied 50 copies and told him to share it with his friends at the summit, so that he can also understand the experience of sharing his art, sharing his work in a very tactile way. And so we have the NumPy comic universe. But imagine if we had the Python comic universe. Czar is just the beginning. And so these stories are telling our lived experiences. And something that I had people repeatedly tell me was, I can give this comic to my daughter and say, this is what I do. I can finally explain open source to my normie friends. And Sankit was able to give that to his girlfriend and say, hey, this is what I do. So we're now approaching the closing, the advice, the whole thing that kind of makes this a keynote, that makes it a bit more grand. So as I mentioned, it led to my first job in tech. And that is because I was at a Python conference just like this one. And I did that by embracing my unique skill set and having the spirit of open source, so willing to try and experiment, even if I don't fit the expected or typical profile. Another really big part of how open source opened my opportunities was getting me supported and connected to my mentors, Melissa, Anessa, and Ralph. And they did that really big step of giving me that trust, that vote of confidence, even when there's not a clear pathway for a designer. They said, hey, let's make it happen. We'll figure it out together. And there's also something to say about the maturity of the open source landscape, some commentary, that it's at this point that it can support and welcome someone like me in the scientific Python ecosystem that also does documentation, but also does like a form of documentation that is comics and storytelling. I just think it's really neat to see the history of open source evolve and reach out to people in a lot of different ways. And so another big part is being supported by the community. So as I mentioned, I was part of the NumFocus Summit, and I got to meet a lot of people that I've only met like online for community calls for like 3-4 years, and it was just amazing to be able to like meet them and talk about the future of NumPy and like continue to build that future with them. And that is exactly where I made this art comics. This is also where I got support from PyLadies. So when I went to PyCon US, it was like, whoa, we have such an active community. We had a luncheon, and we had something very similar at PyLadies, PyCon India PyLadies. Again, having that sort of space to talk about what we're going through and support each other through that. Is also where I met Kotis. So again, it's like, whoa, I met someone here, and then we meet over here, and then I met Jyoti at Research Software Engineers. So. And then now that I'm here, last night I got to have this wonderful like post dinner at this Tamil Nadu place. We had like boiler tea, and I had this I really got to use my fingers, and it was just like, whoa. I started off by like talking about Python, and now I'm over here several years later, still doing Python, but connecting to people in different cultures and communities. And I got to try some good food, and also some questionable pan. Yeah, if you know what it is, you know what it is. So another thing that open source gave me was encourage creativity in tech. And creativity, especially in the face of AI. I'm not going to get on too long of a tangent, I promise. AI certainly has its uses on automation. There were a few talks, especially this year, talking about how we could use automation. Usha talked about AI and autism. But sometimes people ask me, did you make this comic with AI? No. But maybe a better question, we were to rephrase it, is could generative AI host playful brainstorming sessions on the pain points of learning NumPy in a way that was both engaging to maintainers and newcomers? Could generative AI have hosted zine-making workshops that rekindle the creative spark of developers who are, working in one medium, but finally get to re-experience the joy of doodling in crayon, cutting things out, pasting them together? Could AI do that? I think this kind of leads to the bigger question of with AI, what else do we have left that makes us human? What makes us human is our creativity, our art, and our human connections. And that spirit of creativity and experimentation is exactly the spirit of open source, and is the belief that not just code can radically change the world, but a belief in the alternative systems that could change the world as well. And so there is an advice worksheet in the comics. So again, we're gonna get a copy. I'll make sure it gets in your hands. But I had this section that talks more about if you want to get more practical. I was talking quite lofty here. So And the advice, I would say go to conferences. So thank you all for coming to PyCon India. You're already a winner for doing that. And if you enjoy PyCon India, highly consider volunteering next year because PyCon India is completely run by the volunteers who make it happen. And I had such an amazing time interacting with the volunteers and like making this happen, building that energy is something that I think more of us should be supporting. Volunteer if you can. But I think it's also really important to continue the momentum that we get in big conferences like this by going to a local meetup. PyCon India is only once a year, and your local meetups probably meet more often, such as Mumbai, PyLeads Chennai, or PyDelhi. And so these are the resources and the people. But let's go back to Python. You can start thinking, okay, I use Python for large language models, unit testing, model compression. Some Python projects I use or want to use could be PyTest, PyDI, PySpark, which are all projects that are actually featured in talks at PyCon India this year. And so I think what is the magic, the zhuzh, the secret sauce is when you combine that all together. So in the worksheet, I give an example, like I want to go to X to talk about Y. So I want to go to PyLeads Chennai to talk about unit testing with PySpark. I want to go to a SciPy community call to talk about writing a good first issue that I could contribute to. And so once you're connected to a local community and a global project, you have the human connection that I show in the comics and the human connection that you're having right now. And that makes it so much easier to start contributing and to start having that community in open source. And so, yes, this year I'm the one on the stage telling my story that yes, I did it. Open source has opened my opportunities, and now I get to be like an inspirational keynote telling you all these inspirational things. But I actually invite you next year. I want you to be the one telling your story of how open source will open your opportunities. Thank you. So that is the end of my talk. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to PyCon India for having me as a keynote speaker. I truly, truly appreciate it. If you would like me to share more of my comics or story at another event, I would love to do that. Just let me know. And you could connect with me on my LinkedIn or my Twitter. And if you want to tell me your own open source story or what you think of comics or have fun with art, again, please let me know. I love to have more conversations on this type of thing. Thank you. And I will now pass it to the organizers.
We do have time. I just quickly check. You can just stay here. I will moderate and wait. Hey everyone. If you have any questions, we can actually take them right now. You can just walk up to that place. We have a mic standing there, if that's comfortable. If more people have questions, would love if you can just form a queue there, and we can take the questions one by one.
So you also, like in the slides, there was like you got a grant for NumPy and Matplotlib. So did you also make like Matplotlib comics?
So yes, sharp eye for noticing Matplotlib. So that's actually maybe a correction on my part. So Matplotlib was one of the other projects in that Google Season of Docs that received a grant. So they ended up doing their own documentation thing. They did not get Matplotlib comics. I have actually talked to someone who is part of the Matplotlib community, and we've talked about making something. That's just a matter of connecting like the people and the time and then opportunity with the grants, which is something that I'm trying to figure out this year. So hopefully soon we have Matplotlib comics.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Viraj. Where are the comics?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I am Viraj. Where are the comics?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot here. Yes, so I admit I do not have the comics right now. There was a printing error. The comics will be in the afternoon, so just ambush me and be like, where are the comics? Where are the comics? And I promise you I will have them.
First, I want to say thank you for a fantastic talk. You mentioned at the NumFocus Summit, you ran a workshop to help people discover the types of comics they want to write themselves. I think there are open spaces today during this event. Is that something that we could put on? Is that something that we could do today?
Yeah, I think so. I just need to get paper. I need someone to find me crayons, markers, paper, scissors, and glue.
First of all, thank you for coming to India for PyCon India. I want to ask you, what is the motivation to contribute in the open source projects? I know the passion, those who are having passion, they can. But apart from that, from normal working hours to making time for contributing, so what is the motivation from your side?
Ooh, are we talking about motivation in the face of the daily life struggles of other commitments? Like, why do I keep on doing this to myself? Well, I think that's something that changes definitely year by year. When I was working at QuantSight Labs, I had like 10% of my working hours dedicated to open source. So in that case, I had a very fortunate circumstance that let me work on open source during my working hours. I'm no longer working there, and so me working on open source is something I do more in my volunteer time. I'm justifying it to myself because I have another grant this year to continue working on open source. So I am getting paid for it, but I'm not being like on the scale that I used to be. And now I'm also thinking, like how much more do I want to work on open source if I have like more commitments that are coming once I come back home? So you know what? I'm going to reevaluate that question. How much can I balance doing open source when I have other things going on in my life?
Hi Lee, Hari here. Wonderful talk. I recently read a quote which said, I want AI to do my home chores and dishes and clothing, and I want to focus on art and writing. But I see AI doing art and writing while I am made to do the home chores, right? So what's your take on how Gen AI is taking away some of the creativity in art, and how do you see actually leveraging Gen AI to do 10x or 100x of what you're doing and take comics in a more interactive, engaging way throughout the Python comic universe?
Let me ask. So there's two questions. The first one is, why is AI sucking the soul out of my life? And then the second one is sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, first question is, AI has taken some of the creativity in writing and art. So what's your take on that? And next is, how do you see Gen AI actually being leveraged to amplify the work of what you're doing and sort of multiply that?
Okay, so the first one is about how AI is like taking the creative processes that we have as humans, the ones that I think make us unique. That I think is like a bigger intersecting question about like what are the capabilities of AI and like how, like I think there's like what are we trying to take away? What is like the most, I'm trying to not say anything too controversial because obviously as an artist I have my own views on AI and how it's used in the process. I think maybe the question I can better answer is the second one about how would AI affect the process I'm doing right now. So I think if I were to talk about, say, prototyping, I mentioned earlier about like writing a script. I could probably maybe write a script faster if I use generative AI to do the talking and the back and forth. I think generative AI could also help me do like compositions quickly because sometimes as I'm thinking of thumbnailing, I'm thinking of sketching, I can get stuck. So Gen AI could help me with that as well. But again, Gen AI can't really do the heart of what I'm doing, which is connecting and talking to communities and people.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mars, for the amazing talk. I think it was really engaging and very intriguing, at the same time, very inspiring. Folks, thank you so much again for